And we would like to start this morning with a choral reading. This is how we start all of our classes. So you'll see in front of you today's agenda, and on the right-hand column is a little excerpt from a talk by Howard Zinn. We always say when we do a choral reading, we try to just find a pace together to read out loud. And we'll just share in these thoughts to start us and center us on today's talk. To be hopeful.
It's not just foolishly romantic. It is based on the fact that human history is a history not only of guilty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, and kindness. What we choose to emphasize in this complex history will determine our lives. If we see only the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. If we remember those times and places, and there are so many, where people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act, and at least the possibility of sending this maybe top of the world in a different direction. And if we do act, in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presents, and to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory.
Good morning. It's amazing to see you all here. I'm going to try and read loudly, but if you can't hear me, just throw a hand up and I'll try again. This story is called Duct Tape. In my first year of teaching, a student climbed on the table in my classroom and belted out a poem she had written. Before that moment, she spoke only when absolutely necessary and only in whispers. She never made eye contact. She sat on the floor of my classroom in a corner, week after week, scribbling away in a gigantic notebook. It was a creative writing class, so as long as she was writing, I mostly left her alone. My colleagues, though, fretted about her in faculty meetings. The history teacher, she won't turn in any homework. The geometry teacher, she won't go to the board to work problems. The guidance counselor, she won't even talk to me. I mean, at least she should be talking to me. She writes, I offered, a lot. She's a writer. But I was new, so I didn't know. Or what I knew didn't count. There are grades to give, and standards to meet, and credits to accumulate. No time for poetry. That day, the room was as usual. Students perched wherever they felt comfortable, notebooks open, music playing, all of us writing. Tanzi appeared at my shoulder. "Can I read you a poem?" she whispered. I struggled not to appear too excited. Of course. As I listened, I jotted words and phrases that I heard in my notebook, ready to offer her words back to her when she finished reading, as was our practice in that class. But in the pause, just after the last line, that moment when, as a listener, you're not entirely sure the poem is finished, and you're not entirely sure you want it to be, one of my other students asked simply, "Will you read it again?" As she was reading, someone had turned off the music and everyone had listened. They understood that something was happening that should be witnessed. She looked around the room, making eye contact with her classmates who nodded their agreement. "Please," someone added. It was on the second run-through that she climbed first onto a chair and then onto the table, her voice becoming stronger and louder with each line. And it was in this moment that I started to see that what had started as a temporary gig, a job I landed because I sent a graduation announcement to the right person, might not be so temporary. After her tabletop moment in my class, Tanzi came into her own in other spaces too. She wrote poems, she learned to play chess, she accessorized with face paint and a bracelet of spoons, which she thought beautiful and so liberated from restaurants and then handed out to people as gifts. She carried duct tape in her briefcase and decorated things with it. One morning I found a note from her at my desk. It was sealed with duct tape and a spoon. I still have it nearly 20 years later. It says, "Thank you. I see now that we are all revolutionaries."
Dr. Kumashiro is an award-winning author and editor whose books include Troubling Education, Against the Common Sense, which you have on your table, Teaching and Learning Towards Social Justice, and Bad Teacher, How Blaming Teachers Distorts the Bigger Picture. He's been the director of the Center of Anti-Oppressive Education, a founding member of the Chicagoland Researchers and Advocates for Transformative Education, and president of the National Association for Multicultural Education. In addition, Dr. Kumashiro's work is embedded in our education studies program across all three of our programs, our undergraduate program, our master's program, and our doctoral program. And further, Dr. Kevin Kumashiro's work is a foundational framework that Julie and I have used in developing the UOTeachOUT program. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Kevin Kumashiro.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. Good morning. It's such a treat to be here, and I want to begin by thanking Tina and Julie and everyone who's made it possible for me to be here. I think we were kind of calculating when I was last here in Oregon, and I think it was about 5 years ago. So I'm glad to be back and looking forward to my second visit, and I'm also looking forward to these great conversations. So what we thought we'd do today is actually divide this session into 3 parts. And we'll sort of follow the same pattern where I'll talk for a little bit, and then there'll be time for you to have small group discussions, and then we'll repeat that 3 times. And the 3 sections will really be divided thematically. So we're going to begin by talking about the big picture in terms of what's going on, what's the larger landscape of what's happening in education today. Then we'll focus much more small picture in terms of how do we take some of these themes and translate them into classroom practice. And then finally, we'll talk about how do we move forward and what are some ways that we can act collectively to bring about more systemic change. Okay? So what I thought I'd do today is, as I was thinking about my presentation, I was thinking about some things that were happening around the nation that seem to be unconnected to education, but that I think reflect some of the central themes that I want us to reflect on this morning. So let me begin by talking about, I just flew up from California. We have the worst sort of drought, ways that we're trying to address the drought in our state's history. So I want to talk a little bit about the drought. I'll talk a little bit about Baltimore, and then I'll talk a little bit about Vietnam. So worst drought, or at least the worst restrictions on water usage in the history of California. So what this makes me think about is the film, not Waiting for Superman, but it was made by the same person, Inconvenient Truth. Does everyone remember? So Inconvenient Truth came out a few years ago, and it was about climate change. And I was just talking about this film the other day because I was saying, for about 95% of that film, I was loving it. But do you all remember how that film ended? So here's a film that's talking about structural reasons, societal reasons, even economic reasons why we have climate change. But then the whole end of the film basically says, how do we address it? We all need to drive less. We all need to turn off our lights. So what they basically did is take a systemic problem and reduce it to the role of individuals. Okay. And by the way, those who want to think more and learn more about societal contributions, particularly economic contributions to climate change, can look at Naomi Klein's newest book, This Changes Everything, which basically argues that capitalism and the corporate sector need to be understood in terms of their role for contributing to climate change. So Baltimore, and the protests going on in Baltimore, reminds me of a few months ago when the director of the FBI released their report of Ferguson. I don't know how many of you are paying attention to the press conference around this. But at first, I was listening to NPR right after the press conference, and I was fascinated by 2 things. One is the summary of the report. And as I'm listening to the summary of the report, I'm thinking to myself, well, this is great. Like, how fantastic that the FBI is going to come out and say we need to address what they were calling unconscious bias. And they were saying, well, why are we not surprised that we all have biases? We grew up in a society where it's not surprising that we're going to begin to form stereotypes and biases of other groups. So what's the recommendation? We need to address bias. And I thought, what a great recommendation. And how great that the FBI is going to say this. And so the first commentator that was brought onto the show, the NPR show, actually began by saying that he's very unhappy with this report. And I thought, wow, how could that be? And he said, because what the report does is it treats the problem of racial disproportionality in the criminal justice system, and it reduces it to the level of individual bias among police officers. And what he's arguing is if we're really going to address racial disproportionality, racial profiling within the criminal justice system, we actually need to look at the system of the criminal justice system. We need to look systemically, right? And to me, a great example of this is the so-called war on drugs, right? There are many drugs that are illegal to use. We all know that, right? We also know that we tend to arrest. In fact, we tend to go after those who use only certain kinds of drugs more than other kinds of drugs. We also know that of those who are arrested, the usage of certain kinds of drugs tends to lead to a jail time, whereas if you use other kinds of drugs and you're arrested, you tend to get monetary fines. Now, who we tend to criminalize and how we punish those criminals are very much related to the kinds of communities in which they're being used, right? So what are the drugs? The drugs that we tend to police more are those that are used more by black and brown people in inner cities, and they're also the ones that tend to lead towards more jail time. This is an example, in other words, of how the criminal justice system isn't just about going after criminals. It's actually about criminalizing populations differently than one another, right? It's a system that we need to look at, not only individuals. Finally, I was listening to, this is the 40th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, right? Seymour Hersh was being interviewed on a radio program. Seymour Hersh is the one who broke the story of the My Lai massacre and other related massacres during the war. And what he shared with us is, when the Army did its investigation, they found, of course, that there were problems. But here's what the armed forces were basically arguing at the time. What they were basically arguing is that here's an example of leaders and soldiers who went bad. So what do we need to do? We need to punish the leaders and soldiers who did these very atrocious acts. And that's what they did. They criminalized a few people. What Seymour reminds us, however, is that war and atrocities aren't only about individuals going bad, right? We can think, for example, about policies where at the time of the Vietnam War, what was one way that you got promoted up the ranks? It was you document how many people you eliminated of the enemy side, right? We were actually building a system where those kinds of atrocities were actually incentivized. Okay, so in all of these examples, what I'm trying to argue is that our tendency is to focus on the role of the individual, is to blame individuals and to try to fix individuals as the solution. And this is the theme then that I want to try to get at, is that in education, we also do this. The conversations in education tend to focus so much on the role of the individual that we lose sight of the system and how the system is broken. So the way I want to try to get at this analysis of the system is actually by telling this fascinating story I heard a few years ago. It's a story told by Lani Guinier. Many of you remember Lani Guinier, right? A law professor at Harvard, was nominated within the Clinton administration. She wrote a book in 2004 called The Miner's Canary, and my story comes from this book. So in her book, The Miner's Canary, she talks about being at a family party. So they're at a family party, and they're out in the backyard, and the kids, these really young kids, are doing this relay race. It's the race where you have to carry an egg or a golf ball in a spoon, and you run a little bit, and you pass the ball to the next person, and you run a little bit, right? And it's two teams, and whichever team can get the ball to the other side of the yard first wins. Okay. So in this game, it was girls versus boys, and the girls won. So the boys demanded a rematch, and then the girls won again. So on the sideline were all these professorly types like Guinier, and she kind of jokes, what do we professor types like to do best in a situation like this? Well, we like to sit on the sidelines and analyze everything that's going on. So that's exactly what they did, and they were asking questions like, so why are the girls winning? Are they more coordinated? Are they more patient? And what's up with the boys? Why are they unable to compete in this game? Well, she points out that at one point the conversation paused when one of the grandmothers asked, well, who came up with this game? And it's at that point that Gutierrez reminds us that when we're trying to understand a problem, we tend to only ask certain kinds of questions. And perhaps the most important questions are those we never really ask. We never get around to asking. So she tells us there are 3 kinds of questions that we should be asking when we're trying to understand a problem. The most common one is what the parents were asking. And that question is, who is winning and who is losing? Who's winning and who's losing? And she suggests that we ask the question of who's winning and who's losing because we want to try to figure out what the winners are doing so that we can help the losers to better compete. In other words, often our solution is to fix the losers, right? Well, there's a second kind of question we should be asking. And that's the question that the grandmother was asking. Who made the rules? Who made the rules? Because what Gutierrez reminds us is that it's often people in positions of power who make the rules, and we often make the rules in ways that advantage us. So in this case, it's not surprising that we should be aware that the girls chose the game. It's not to say that they are naturally more coordinated or more patient. It's to say we shouldn't be surprised that they chose the game in which they were more likely to win, and in fact, in which they did win twice. Okay. Well, Gutierrez goes on to say that there's a third kind of question that we should be asking, which is perhaps the most important, and which is definitely the one that we tend to ask the least often. And that question is, what is the story that we tell the losers to get them to continue playing the game? What's the story that we're all buying into? In this situation, the boys saw that they were losing. They knew that the girls chose the game, but they still insisted on a rematch. They were still buying into the story that this game was fair and that they had a chance to win. Now, what Gutierrez suggests is that we need to be asking all 3 sets of questions if we want to get a really full picture of the problem and what are better solutions. So what I like to do is take these 3 questions and apply them to education. So let's quickly talk then about what's going on in education. So who's winning and who's losing? We often think we can answer that question by looking at test scores. And in the United States, we have this fixation on the so-called achievement gap, what many call the achievement gap. So achievement are measures of learning. And if we look at, say, standardized test scores, we see a big gap in the test scores. And this is the achievement gap. We see it by gender, we see it by social class, we see it by age. But primarily when we talk about the achievement gap, we're talking about the gap by race. And on one level, there are the test scores of white American and Asian American students. And below a gap tend to be the scores of all other groups of color, African American, Latino, Native American, Pacific Islander students. So for many groups, closing the gap has been the major goal, right? How do we get these groups to perform like these? Okay. It was 9 years ago that one of the biggest names in multicultural education, Gloria Ladson-Billings, wrote her article that she kind of contrasts the achievement gap with what she calls the education debt. And what she argues is that the focus on the gap misses and masks the much larger problem of what she wants to call the education debt. In other words, the difference in individual performance masks the much larger problem of systemically what's wrong with education. Right? And she points to a number of factors of this debt. And let me point to 3, but actually let me first explain why she calls this the debt. So she reminds us that every summer there's all this debate in our nation's capital around balancing the national budget and avoiding a budget deficit. So deficit is where you spend more than you take in. So we're going to cut pet projects and favoritism to one state and pork spending in order to balance the budget and avoid a deficit. What she argues is that this focus on the deficit masks the much larger problem of the national debt. So the debt So the debt is the sum of the deficits over the past almost century now, totaling, I lost track, but I believe it's around $15 trillion right now. It earns billions of dollars in interest a year that we often can't pay, which means even when you balance the budget and avoid a deficit, the debt can continue to grow. So that has built up over a century. If we look at education, we can argue that the education debt has actually accumulated for almost 2 centuries now, making it almost inevitable a difference in test scores. And so what are some aspects of this larger debt, this larger systemic problem? Let me point to 3. One is segregation. Our schools have always been segregated. And some people think we ended segregation with Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, but we know that schools did not desegregate after Brown. It took about 10 years until the 1964 Civil Rights Act that we began to desegregate schools. And for about a quarter century, our nation was actually desegregating our schools, and we made the largest gains for African American students in the South. But beginning in the 1980s, the courts began to let expire the mandatory desegregation programs. And by the late 1980s, as the court-ordered desegregation programs were expiring, we returned to what we've always used to assign students to schools, which is residence. And given that our neighborhoods in this country are incredibly racially segregated, we should not be surprised that if that's the basis for school assignment, so too will be schools, right? Beginning by around 1988, we began to reverse trend. We've entered a period that scholars are calling resegregation. So that right now, it's actually the case that in some parts of this country, schools are even more segregated than they were when we began desegregation a half a century ago. This problem will continue to get worse because our neighborhoods are actually becoming increasingly segregated. So political scientists, sociologists are using the term hypersegregation to begin to define this level of increased segregation, right? What's the second problem going on with schools? Well, second problem is inequitable funding. Many of you know the book written in 1994 by Jonathan Kozol called Savage Inequalities, right? And he tells us that it's possible in this country for a school district to be spending about 3 times as much per pupil as a district right next door. Why? Because so much of school funding comes from local property, is based on local property taxes. So you live in a place with expensive homes, there's a lot more money going into your public schools. Okay. Well, right now we see that in some parts of this country, that gap has also gotten worse. So it's possible for school districts to be spending more than 4 times as much per pupil as a district nearby. And why is this happening? Because, as we know, the wealth gap in this country continues to expand. There are scholars who are arguing that the wealth gap, the difference between the very wealthy and the very poor, is actually worse now than when we entered the Great Depression almost a century ago. And if school funding is based on local wealth, and the wealth gap is getting bigger, then it's not surprising that funding inequity will also get bigger, right? And this isn't to say that segregation or difference in funding is the only problem or the only cause for problem. But it is to say that we have so much research that links, right, separate schools or very disparate, like drastically unequal levels of funding, that we see the connection between those kinds of attributes and what's actually happening in schools. Let me make a third point that's systemic in nature, which is how we make decisions, governance, right? So Ladson-Billings argues that we have historically disenfranchised certain groups from the decision-making process. We've always had a problem getting inclusive decision-making and really democratic processes. But what I would argue is that in the past few years, this problem has also gotten worse. Because more and more what we see is that reforms in this country are not driven by educators. They are not driven even by elected officials. Increasingly, reforms in this country is being driven by a smaller and smaller group, which is those who have money. So let's talk about the second question by Gutierrez, which is who made the rules? There are 2 major groups that are driving school reform right now. One are the corporations, and one are the philanthropies. Corporations. Pearson is a great example, right? Schools have always been modeled after the business sector in this country, right? But what we see increasingly is that the business sector is intentionally trying to impact education policy. And so to me, a really good example, let me give 2 examples of this. Right now, we have Arne Duncan as our Secretary of Education. And Arne Duncan used to be CEO of Chicago's public schools. So I used to live in Chicago. So I feel like I know a lot about what's happening in Chicago. So where did the whole turnaround school policy model come from? Well, that came from Chicago, right? It was experimented with in Chicago. Arne Duncan's signature reform in Chicago is called Renaissance 2010. Right? It was launched at around 2003, I think. The goal of Renaissance 2010 was to close down about 60 or 70 so-called failing schools and open up about 100 smaller schools in their place. Right? This should sound familiar because this became national policy under his administration. Okay. Where did he get this idea? Well, a year before Duncan announced Renaissance 2010, we can trace back to see the release of a report, a much less publicized report called Left Behind. Left Behind is a report that was put out by a group called the Commercial Club of Chicago. This is a group that brings together the top business leaders in Chicago. What did they call for? They called for closing down about 60 or 70 so-called failing schools, opening up about 100 smaller schools. And they wanted those schools to be charter schools that were run by for-profit management companies. In other words, their argument was that the public sector has failed. And so how are we going to fix public schools? We need to privatize the school district. Right? Now, Duncan took out the part about charter schools and for-profit management companies explicitly. But what's the reality? The reality is we've opened about 100 newer schools. The majority of them are charter schools, and the majority of them are run by for-profit management companies. Right? In fact, even national policy around standards and accountability. Standards and accountability is not an Obama policy. It is not a George Bush policy. It was not even a Clinton policy. People like to trace standards and accountability to Clinton's Goals 2000. Right? That kind of set the stage for what would be the hallmark of standards and accountability, which is No Child Left Behind. But actually, before Clinton was Bush, and before Bush was Reagan. And it was in the Reagan administration where we began to see the shift towards this language of standards and accountability. And who do we often credit for coming up with the framework of the standards and accountability reform? It's not the Reagan administration. It's actually the Business Roundtable. It's a Business Roundtable report called The 9 Essential Principles that lays the groundwork for this reform. Okay? So the business sector, lots of influence over policy, even though we don't often acknowledge. Right? Who else has been very influential? It's the philanthropies. Places like the Gates Foundation, and the Broad Foundation, and the Walton Family Foundation, which in just a city, in a year, can be investing millions or even tens of millions of dollars to experiment with school reform. Right? What's happening in philanthropy right now is really interesting, those of us who look at philanthropy, because for most of the 20th century, this is what traditional philanthropy looked like. I have $5 million, and I look around the room and I say, hey, you're doing this great reform. Let me give you $5 million to support that reform. That is traditional philanthropy. What we've seen arise over the past maybe 15 years is a new type of philanthropy, which some like to call venture philanthropy. Venture philanthropy looks sort of like this. I have $5 million, and I approach you, and I say, hey, I'm going to give you this $5 million if you launch my reform. Does everyone see the difference? It's not I'm going to find something to support. It's I'm going to leverage my resources in order to get the kinds of reforms that I want to see happen. The term comes from the term venture capitalism, right, which is all about leveraging my resources to make more wealth. In this case, I'm leveraging my resources to have more policy influence. But does this lead to more revenue? Absolutely. Because public education in this country is estimated to be about a $600 billion enterprise that's being outsourced more and more every year. There's enormous profit to be made in public education, and that's exactly what's happening. Right? So I've talked about desegregation. I've talked about inequitable funding. I've talked about undemocratic decision-making processes. Why are these not the things that we talk about when we debate education? Why is it that we're simply blaming the teachers? And in fact, you all may remember the National News magazine from about 10 years ago when Michelle Rhee was the chancellor of DC Public Schools. Do you all remember the cover story of that where she's holding a broom? And what the story basically said is that she kind of signaled, she represented this new generation of reformers, right? Now, what was the evidence that she was a reformer? It's that she came in and she fired a bunch of principals and teachers, right? Again, the story is that schools are failing. And schools are failing because we have too many lazy and incompetent teachers and principals. So what's the solution? We need to measure, measure, measure to hold everyone accountable, get rid of the bad ones, and reward the good ones. This is national policy, right? All right. Did I jump ahead? I did, because my question was, why are we not talking about the bigger picture? We're not talking about the bigger picture because of the third question that Gutierrez is asking, which is, what is the story that we're all buying into? And the way I like to kind of flesh out this question is to ask myself, what has become so commonsensical today that we don't even question? About 100 years ago, it was kind of common sense to say that if you were a girl, you should not get too much education. You should not get too much schooling. So indeed, we either didn't send girls to schools, or by around 5th grade, they stopped going to school. So why did we do that? Well, there are some people who believe that women belonged in the home, so why should they get schooling? There are some people who believe that women would compete with men for jobs, so why should they get so much schooling? But some of you may be aware, in one of my favorite books when I was in grad school, is a thing written by Christine Battersby. Those of you who are foundations people, do you know Christine Battersby? So Christine Battersby wrote this wonderful piece about education for girls about a century ago. And here's what she reminds us. There was a science of that time that was telling us something like this. The mind is connected to the body. And if you mess with one, you might mess with the other. So girls should not get too much education because it might make them crazy, or it might make them physically ill, or it might even make them infertile. So today, some of us look back and say, wow, what a crazy idea. Like, you learn too much and you can't have babies. But my point is that about 100 years ago, for many people, that was kind of common sense. And about 50 years ago, it's kind of common sense to say that if you had darker skin, you should not get too much education. And why did we say that? Well, there were parallel arguments there, right? Like if you had darker skin, some people felt that you would compete with others for jobs. But we also know that there was a science of that time that was telling us something like, people with darker skin did not have as much intellectual capacity. We're not as smart. We're not as able to learn as much. So why should we waste our time and our resources teaching them? Today, many of us look back and we say, that's a pretty racist thing to say. But my point is to say that about 50 years ago, for many people, that was just common sense. And I say all of this not to poke fun at people 50 or 100 years ago, but rather to raise the question 50 years from now, how might we look back and say, I can't believe in 2015 it was common sense to think this? Right? What is the common sense of today that we're not even seeing that's getting in the way of us understanding what the real problems and better solutions in education are? And there are so many commonsensical stories that we can point to, right? Things that have some historical reason for them, but really maybe not as much research to back it. Why do we run the school year, for example, from September to June, and everyone gets up in arms every time we say, let's do year-round schooling? Well, September to June, there was a historical reason why the school year runs from that, right? We began mass public education at a time when we were much more of an agrarian or agricultural society. So of course the school year is going to mirror that pattern. Why the school year from 8 to 3? Well, for very similar reasons. Why do we have about 30 or 40 students per class? Like, does the research say that that's how many students should be in each classroom? Not really. Why do we divide the subjects, like 50 minutes of math and 50 minutes of reading and 50 minutes of... Does the research say that that's the best way to teach? Well, actually, the research isn't very compelling on that, right? All of these things have historical reason. Why do we do 50 minutes of math? Just side note. Well, there was a think tank that around the early 1900s says the best way that we should teach is we should divide things into disciplines. Each of them should be a little bit every day. And so nowadays, it's become so commonsensical. We think, oh, that's how schools always have looked, and that's how schools always should look. Well, the reality is around the world, that's not how schools look. Not everyone does that, right? There's a lot of research that's quite compelling around maybe interdisciplinary curriculum or block scheduling or things like that. But no, we always fight it because common sense tells us that that's not how schools should look. In fact, why would we sit and listen to someone nonstop for like 25 minutes? Because the research doesn't actually say that this is the best way to teach. The research says that the different ways of teaching have different benefits. That's what we know from the research, right? We know that this doesn't work for everybody. We also know that no one can actually sit still This is brain science. Brain science tells us that no one can actually focus uninterrupted for like 30 or 45 minutes, right? In fact, what the brain does is it constantly goes off on these digressions, right? So, you know, when I was talking about 100 years ago, for example, you might have been thinking to yourself, 100 years ago, oh yeah, my grandmother's birthday is coming up and I need to go shopping for a present. I mean, you know, that's how the brain works, right? It's always going on these digressions. So why do we think that we can stand up and talk nonstop, right? And yet, the older you get, this is more likely what instructional delivery looks like. Hopefully it won't take 50 years from now for us to say, well, I can't believe in 2015 this was the primary mode of instruction, or this was the primary mode of professional development. I'm trusting you all are following me, even though I am talking for 30 minutes. But I'm almost going to pause. I'm almost at the end of this first presentation. So my point here, we need to question common sense. And we need to question common sense not only in terms of our everyday micro practices, but also in terms of the macro. So let me point to one very big commonsensical story that is framing school reform right now and is driving, I would argue, all of the major initiatives happening. And that is the story that test scores tell us everything we need to know. So probably no one in this room will agree with that story, but the reality is that all of the major reforms are still based on the idea that test scores are going to tell us everything we need to know. Elementary and Secondary Education Act, hopefully you all are following that this is being authorized right now. It's being debated in the Senate right now, right? It passed unanimously out of a pretty, we would argue, progressive education committee. What's happening in the reauthorization of ESEA? Well, there's some good things happening, which is that the federal government should no longer be able to prescribe to states how to use test scores. So that's a good thing. But that's sometimes the only thing that people focus on. In other words, there are some progressives who are like, we're getting rid of high-stakes testing. Yay, let's support this bill. I am urging us to be much more, smart and do our homework about this bill. I urge us to read the bill and think about what's actually in there. What the bill is actually doing, and the reason I would not support it, is because what it does is it basically says, let's delegate decision-making to the states. Now, some of you know the history of federal legislation. ESEA was created precisely to allow the federal government to intervene in what's happening at the states. Right? This was one of the hallmark legislations of the civil rights movement. We are not now going to gut that legislation to allow states to do what we might imagine is exactly what we've been doing up until now. Why would we imagine anything is going to be different, right? This overemphasis on testing. There are so many things going on, though. The school turnaround movement is based on high-stakes testing. Teacher merit pay, which is spreading to state legislatures across the country, is based on high-stakes testing. The proposed federal teacher preparation regulations, are we all following this one? So back in December, right, the Department of Ed announced their proposal for how we're going to regulate 25,000 teacher prep programs in this country. And what's the heart of their proposal? The heart of their proposal is that every program should track their graduates for 3 years, and we should see whether they're going to be able to raise test scores. And if they cannot, then we withhold federal funding for those programs, particularly in the form of federal student financial aid. So why is this such a problem? Well, so many reasons why this is a problem. But let me point to the main one. The Department of Ed loves value-added modeling. Value-added modeling is a way of doing statistical analysis where we're trying to get rid of all extraneous, all other factors in order to see what's the value that is added by having this teacher with this group of students. So let's get rid of all of the factors and let's see if we can attribute the gains in test scores to this teacher. That's value-added modeling, and it's hard, right? Okay. What's the problem? The problem is that statisticians, quantitative scientists are telling us that doesn't work in this case. The tests that students are taking were never designed to make the kinds of decisions that we're making, right? Therefore, they're neither valid nor are they reliable, which means if you actually try to use them and you look, what's the results? Well, the results are really problematic. In fact, what we see is that in a 3-year period, value-added modeling has about a 36% error rate or something like that. Over a 10-year period, that reduces to about a third, which means even in a 10-year period, there is a significant error rate using value-added modeling, right? We could go on with that, but let's move on to other topics because there's so many things to talk about with that one. But my point is that what we're doing right now is we're buying into the commonsensical story that test scores tell us everything we need to know, right? Common sense tells us we need an objective instrument. Common sense tells us that this is something that we can apply equally across schools, no matter what region, no matter quality of teacher, no matter whatever. And common sense tells us that if students' achievement is going up, it must be because of a teacher that had them. And if the teacher is successful, it must be because of the program that prepared them. There's some common sense behind that logic model, right? My point is, though, let's not rely on common sense, because the research does not back that model. All right. This leads to handout number 1. Because handout number 1 is asking you in small groups to please think about what are some of the commonsensical stories circulating right now in education. Let's take about 10 minutes to have this conversation. So I'm reminded of the challenge of thinking and wanting to address these bigger problems when feeling so many constraints because we are told we need to do this, or we need to meet these requirements, or we're being surveyed, or we're being watched. So we're gonna, in my next 2 presentations, really focus on this idea of how do we do this work in this paradoxical moment, in this contradictory moment, right? We want to do certain kinds of work in a context where we're being told we're not supposed to be doing that kind of work. So I want to kind of highlight that is one complexity that I want us to continue to grapple with throughout the morning. What I wanted to do in the second section of the session is to focus much more on how we do classroom practice in ways that address some of these larger issues. So I'm going to talk about what I call 4 lenses for social justice teaching or for anti-oppressive teaching. So 4 lenses. And why lenses? So I like to tell the story of how, I don't know how it was where all of you were growing up. Well, where I was growing up, sometimes if you were dating someone, the 2 of you had our song. A song that has special meaning because maybe it's the first song you danced to or the first song you had dinner to or, whatever. And every time that song plays on the radio, you're both like, oh, right? Until you break up with that person, right? And then every time that song plays on the radio, you don't want to hear that song. So that to me is a perfect example of how our life experiences are constantly creating unique lenses that we look through to make sense of the world around us. Lenses that are colored by our childhood upbringing, our educational experiences, our professional training, our cultural background, right? It helps us to understand why 2 people can walk into the same movie and have a different reaction. It's why 2 people can sit through the same lecture and hear very different things. It's also why the same person at different times in their life can respond to the same song differently. Okay. Well, what I'd like to do is offer 4 lenses for thinking about how we do classroom teaching, to see if it invites us to make sense of the work of teaching differently. The first lens is about curriculum. So I sometimes do this activity with either emerging teachers or even with veteran teachers, where I ask people to brainstorm all the ideas, all the examples that come to mind when we let me try it again. What are all the ways that gender can be observed in schools? So we brainstormed this question. How does gender come up? And let me just offer some of the thoughts that I'm sure many of us in this room would offer, right? It comes up in things like, well, before I say that, what I often do is we're brainstorming and I'm putting their responses on 2 different lists. So there's one list that consists of things like Women's History Month. Let's study women authors. Well, let's study about women in science. Let's study about, the Equal Rights Amendment, gender equity legislation. Okay, so lessons about women and gender. And then there's a much longer list that includes all other ways that gender comes up in schools. Things like how we tease people. Like we tell a boy, you throw like a girl, or we tell a girl, you're dressing like a boy. Or how we staff schools. We notice that most of the teachers are women and most of the administrators are men. Or what are we studying? Well, in history, the way we define history, we tend to study mostly male actors in history, right? Once in a while, if there's a woman in there, it's like a sidebar. It's like a woman was there too, right? Our English classes are mostly male authors, right? Okay, so as you might imagine, the shorter list is what we would call the formal curriculum. It's where we're actually write up a lesson plan to try to teach explicitly about gender or about women. The much longer list is what we would call the hidden or the unofficial curriculum. It's all the other ways that gender comes up that I often don't intend for them to come up, but they still teach something, right? And as you might imagine, the longer list, all the indirect ways that gender comes up, all the subtle ways that gender comes up, is much more pervasive. It's much more everyday. It's echoing the messages they hear out in larger society. And because it's so much more pervasive and so much more everyday, because it's not so much what we say, but actually what we do, it's the hidden curriculum that is the far more powerful teacher. Right? So in schools, when we talk about, well, how do we address gender equity? What we often focus on is the short list. We often think, how do we address gender equity? Let's do a workshop. How do we address gender equity? Let's add a unit, right? And I think what this activity shows is actually you can add all the units you want, but you might not actually have the kind of impact you want in addressing equity unless you also address that much longer list. Okay. What's the problem? Well, that is the problem. But here's another problem. Another problem is once we understand that there's a hidden curriculum, how do we respond? So sometimes I do this workshop and I say, well, all right, so we see that the hidden curriculum is so much more powerful, right? In fact, let's even think about a really explicit example. We often say, let's treat boys and girls the same. But if they notice that it's the men who are holding leadership positions, if they notice that they're mostly reading about men in history, if they hear you say, how about the girls help me sweep and the boys help me move the tables, all of those are much more powerful teachers, right? Okay. So sometimes I ask, so what do we do about this hidden curriculum? And many people will say, well, I would strive to teach a classroom where there is not a hidden curriculum, right? So what I want to do with my first story about curriculum is emphasize that there is always a hidden curriculum, right? We can never get away from a classroom or a school where there are unintended messages coming through, right? In fact, this is a great example. Often when I'm doing this workshop and I'm saying things like, let's be interactive, let's be student-centered, let's be experiential. How do I run the workshop? I often do exactly what I'm doing right now, which is I stand up and I lecture most of the time. So my formal message might be, make things interactive. That's the more powerful way of teaching. But your observation, the hidden curriculum is, but actually, the most effective way really is for me to stand up and do most of the talking, right? And that is the hidden curriculum that not only can differ from the formal, it can actually contradict it, right? So there is always, in other words, going to be a hidden curriculum. There will always be unintended lessons. So how do we then address this reality that there will always be a hidden curriculum? All right. The way I think about how we address the hidden curriculum, I think is something, comes from a story that I want to share where I learned about the power of the hidden curriculum. And it's when I was working with student teachers. So I was doing this lesson with student teachers. It was on multicultural curriculum, multicultural education. And I was trying to use music as an example. You know, I was trying to say, look, the canon in music education is classical music. So how do we broaden that curriculum? Well, we incorporate music from different cultures and different time periods in different parts of the world. So this is what I was doing. I was teaching. I grew up in Hawaii, and I was teaching them a song from Hawaii. So I taught them the beginning of the song, and I said, let's brainstorm some stereotypes that come to mind when we think of the words Hawaii, Hawaiian music, Hawaiian culture. And a lot of the things that we brainstorm are things that many of us in here would probably brainstorm. Things like stereotypical images, right? So Waikiki Beach and hula dancing and coconut bras and palm trees and the volcano and the pig in the ground and so a lot of the foods and festivals and landscapes are things that many of us we brainstorm. None of those are inaccurate. Those are all parts of Hawaiian history and culture, right? Okay. So what I did is I asked people to close your eyes, picture those images as I sing the beginning of this song, and to ask yourself what meanings and feelings are brought up when we put side by side those images with this song. Okay. I then proceeded to tell them a different story of Hawaii, a story that some of you may also be familiar with. Hawaii is one of the 50 states. It's the newest state, and it used to be its own kingdom. There are 8 major islands in the Hawaiian chain. Each had been ruled by different chiefs until around the beginning of the 1800s, when one chief, Kamehameha, united all of these islands, either through family connections or through conquest. And for about 100 years, he and his descendants ruled the islands. There are 5 Kamehamehas, a Lunalilo, a King Kalakaua, and then a Queen, Liliuokalani. It was in the late 1800s when the Queen was forced to abdicate or give up her throne. Eventually, Hawaii became acquired as a territory and then a state of the United States. Now, many people know of the central role in that overthrow played by businessmen and military leaders from the United States, right? Businessmen because of the rich natural resources that were being exported at that time, and military leaders because Hawaii is really right in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, great strategic location for the military, and indeed, if you think about it, the late 1800s is when the United States was entering one of its wars, right? Well, there was a third group that was playing a very influential role in that overthrow, and it was Christian missionaries and their descendants from the United States. Christian missionaries were present in the Hawaiian Islands since before the kingdom was formed. And it was as early as the second king that they began to exert enormous influence, not only over politics, governance, and the economy, but also over arts and culture. So song and dance was often a way that the Hawaiian peoples would resist outside forces. But it also began to incorporate the values and the messages from outside forces. The song that I taught is actually one of the most popular songs in Hawaii. It's taught I learned it in elementary school. It's taught in elementary schools all the time. The lyrics were written by the last queen. It's a song called Kanaka Vai Vai. Anyone familiar? Kanaka Vai Vai? It was when I was in college that I went back and I was looking at the translation of this song. So the translation of this song is a parable from the New Testament. It's the parable where a wealthy man approaches Jesus and says, how do I get into heaven? And Jesus says, give away your possessions. The translation of Kanaka Vai Vai is wealthy man. What I ask people to do is picture this different story of Hawaii, a story of a former kingdom, a story of overthrow, a story of basically both imperialism and colonialism, right? And to ask yourself whether different meanings and feelings are brought up when we put side by side different images, but with the very same song. And as you might imagine, people responded that the song felt differently. It sounded differently. It sounded more sad. It conjured up all kinds of different emotions, maybe emotions of anger, emotions of frustration, emotions of guilt. And that's not surprising because it's not unlike the story I was telling you earlier about dating someone and having our song, right? A different lens will lead you to learn that song differently. And this is actually what we tell literature teachers, art teachers, music teachers all the time, right? That we need to give a cultural context so that they can better understand or more deeply learn the song. Well, the question, though, is if you only have, say, 45 minutes to give the cultural context, what is the story of that culture that you're telling? In my lesson, I was trying to show that depending on the story you tell, you're going to learn that song a little bit differently. It's not the case that one of those stories is the more accurate story. Both stories, the stereotypical images and the monarchy and overthrow, are accurate, right? They're just both partial stories, right? You're never going to tell a full story. So the question really is to get students to see how different stories will lead them to learn a text differently. It's not what is the better story. It is how does the partiality of the story lead me to learn in only certain ways. Okay. So this was the lesson, and I thought, wasn't that a brilliant lesson? And so I would often have them debrief, right? This was a class for student teachers, and I often wanted to model different ways of teaching and then have them talk about strengths and weaknesses. So we brainstormed the strengths and weaknesses of this lesson. And what I was trying to actually get them to see is that many of the strengths are actually also the weaknesses, right? This was about a 45-minute lesson, and every time I wanted them to sing, I had them stand up. And people were saying, yeah, no one can sit still for 45 minutes, so it's a good thing that you were having them move. Well, what's the weakness to that? Well, imagine if you had maybe an injury or some kind of pain in your leg, and every time you had to stand up, it caused discomfort. Well, that would distract you from the lesson, right? Same thing that's a strength could be a weakness. We also talked about how if this weren't a music class and I was making everyone sing, well, that could be pretty unusual. And aren't we always saying to teachers, do something memorable, do something out of the ordinary, do something that will help students to remember what it is that they're learning. That's a strength unless you think about the fact that there are many people who are so terrified of singing in public that making them sing in a class can actually close off doors to learning, right? Same thing that's a strength is a weakness, okay? Well, here was one weakness I didn't anticipate. One of the students in the class said, well, I thought it was interesting the way that you had us warm up our voices. So to get them ready to sing, I had them all stand up and we all sang the scale together, you know? 1, 2, 3, I had us sing that. And he said, well, you were telling us how to sing, right? I told them breathe from your diaphragm. I told them open your mouth really wide. And he said, you were implying that that was the better way to sing. Well, that's how I learned to sing. So that is what I thought was the better way to sing. So what was his point? His point was that in different cultural traditions, we use the body differently to produce music. In other words, there are different ways of singing. What you've just done is reinforce the privilege of that one way of singing. And ironically, it's the way of singing in the form of music that you're actually trying to expand, right? Classical music. So at the time, I thought, wow, that's a really good point. And so then I said, that's a good point. And then I moved on into that. But what I appreciate now is to think back at how that is actually the moment, the kind of learning that we want to see happen, right? Where their learning exceeds what it is that they're learning. Because if they simply bought into my story of Hawaii, or if they simply bought into my way of teaching, was I really teaching them to think for themselves? And in fact, isn't this one of the major criticisms of multicultural education, right? That we're simply imposing over one dominant or hegemonic view another politically correct one. The goal isn't to come up with the right story. The goal is to get students to question the partiality of any story that we teach. And that means that the power of the hidden curriculum is precisely when it enters into the curriculum, right? What makes teaching powerful, in other words, is when you get students to grapple with what is the hidden curriculum in the classroom. That can never be predicted. That can never be foretold, precisely because the hidden curriculum is exactly what you do not plan, right? It is uncontrollable. It is unpredictable. It is uncomfortable because of that. And yet I would argue that is arguably the most powerful teaching that we can do. What does this lead me to ask? What are elements of the hidden curriculum in our educational spaces? And how might we utilize that hidden curriculum to benefit our work? Okay. Let me talk about a second lens. And this lens is about students. I'm going to connect it to standards, though. And the theme I want to talk about is the culture of power. The culture of power. So there's some great work by people like Lisa Delpeat and Shirley Bryce Heath who've talked about kind of the role of culture. And they were writing at a time, late 1980s, well, throughout the 80s, when one of the big emphases in education was culturally relevant, culturally compatible teaching, right? People were saying, why is there such an achievement gap? Why are certain communities struggling so much? And the response was, well, they're growing up in communities where the cultural values and cultural forms of communication differ from what's happening in schools. So what's the solution? We should tailor our way of communicating and interacting to what is happening in their communities, right? There should be a match between the culture of the community and the culture in schools. Okay, it's within this context where a lot of people are arguing that we need to move towards cultural compatibility theories that some of these writings are occurring. So let me talk a little bit about this study by Shirley Bryce Heath. So Shirley Bryce Heath was looking at a community where there was what we now call an achievement gap. There were middle and working class white students, and there were working class black students. And there was a big difference in achievement and school performance. And so her study was to try to understand what was the difference. And the way she did it is she followed the students home, and she was trying to figure out, well, what was going on in the home? Because if you remember, as I just said, in the 1980s, the big thing was, let's figure out what's happening. What's the difference between home and school? Okay. One of the things that she found, which is so fascinating, is that there was a difference between how parents in some communities were communicating versus how parents in other communities were communicating. So what she found is that the parents, and this isn't to stereotype for all white American and African American communities and parents, but it is to say, in this community, what she found is that the African-American parents tended to communicate much more directly. So what was, if, for example, if I was trying to give a command, I would give it in the form of a command. Like, let's say I, as a young kid, was standing here and I was playing with the light switch, and you wanted me to stop playing with the light switch. You would say, Kevin, stop playing with the light switch. And I would know that that means I should stop playing. Okay. What she found is that in many of the white households, the parents communicated much more indirectly. So commands, for example, were often given in the form of questions. If I was standing there and I was flicking with the light switch and you wanted me to stop playing with the light switch, you would say, Kevin, do you think it's time to stop playing with the light switch? And I'm supposed to know that that means stop playing with the light switch. But what she argues is that if you never learn that a question can actually be a command, you might think you're just asking me, do you think it's time to stop? And I might legitimately say, no, I don't think it is. And, but because of that miscommunication, there are educational and material consequences. In other words, if a teacher thinks I'm telling you to stop and you keep playing, I'm not going to see that as a cultural mismatch in communication style. What I'm going to see is you're being disobedient, right? And so then you get punished, right? And so this is what she was trying to argue is, so the prevailing theory at the time was, if they're used to more direct communication, that's how I need to communicate. I need to match my style to what they're used to. So Delpit comes along in the late 1980s and makes a slightly different argument. She says, you know what? That'll work so long as they're in my classroom. But as soon as they leave my classroom, they're going to face the same conflict. So actually, what I need to do is teach them to be culturally savvy, is to teach them that that certain rules apply in one context that might differ than the rules that apply in the other. And this is where she comes up with the term. What she wants students to understand is in the school, there is a culture of power. There's a culture that reflects the dominant or the more powerful group. And what I need to do is teach my students what are those rules. In other words, my job as a teacher is to teach students the unspoken rules for succeeding. What I find, let me give another kind of more high-level meaning, an example for the older grades. So when I first started teaching in college, I was at a small liberal arts school on the East Coast. And I was in a seminar with new faculty. And one of the professors was a physics professor who was teaching a senior honors course. And he said, these are all seniors. And the way I'm going to run this seminar is I want them to teach the beginning of each seminar. And they're all seniors, so that I shouldn't have to teach them how to lead a seminar. They should know how to do that by now. Okay. And I went home that night thinking, Delpit would not be happy. Because what she would argue is, not only are you assuming they know how to teach, you're assuming they know how to teach the way you want them to teach. Now let's think about some disciplinary or even idiosyncratic differences, right? When I get up and I say to my students, I want you to teach, there's an instruction there which I make pretty explicit, which is, I don't want you to act like you know any more than anyone else. I don't want you to teach by coming up and lecture. I want you to lead us through an activity that is more generative. Okay. But I also know professors, when they say you're to come up and teach for 20 minutes, they want you to summarize the main points of the article. They want you to do the exact opposite. So do you see that if you came in with one assumption and you're being graded by the other, you would actually get an F in one course and you would get an A in the other. The unspoken rules need to be made explicit. So this is one of these examples of that, right? And there are so many cultural examples of that as well, right? What's an example of kind of different signs of respect? don't we always say, look me in the eye? You're disciplining someone. Look me in the eye when I'm talking to you. Don't we always say that? All right. Well, we know that in some cultures, what is the respectful thing to do? It is exactly not to look people in the eye, right? In some cultures, the respectful thing to do is maybe look at the nose, right? And to not make eye contact. Are we making explicit the unspoken rules to succeed? What Delpit is arguing is that it isn't the case that we should teach them that this set of rules is better. What I would argue she's arguing, or whether or not she's arguing it, what I would argue is that what we should be teaching is not that one set of rules is better. What we should be teaching students to understand is that different sets of rules apply in different contexts, right? Now, how do I want to connect this with standards? There are many people who say standards is bad. I'm actually one of them. I actually believe that standards is always a partial set. It's always defined by a certain group in a particular moment in history. Let's remember the Lani Guinier questions. It's often people in positions of power who are defining the rules. Okay, but does that mean, and by the way, if I were to come up with a set of standards, wouldn't my set be equally partial? Well, the answer is yes. If I were to come up with standards, my set of standards would also be partial. I might argue it's a better set of partial standards, but it's nonetheless equally partial. So the goal isn't to come up with the better set of standards, nor is the goal to say we shouldn't have standards at all. Because if we don't have standards at all, how can we do what Lisa Delpit is arguing, which is teaching students to be mindful and critical of the partiality of any set of rules. If we act like there's no rules, we're actually not preparing them to be either successful or to be critical. What I actually appreciate about standards is you're naming the official curriculum. The problem I have is when we limit education to those standards. The problem I have is when we're not teaching students to be critical, right? Let's teach the standards, but let's also teach them to critique it, right? A contradictory move, which I think is exemplified in these stories. All right, let me tell one more lens. It's a lens about resistance. So, I love the theories that tell us that, common sense tells us that teaching is about is about developing knowledge that we don't already have. It's like filling a gap. I don't know how to fix a car. So what does teaching involve? It involves learning how to fix a car. It involves gaining that knowledge, right? All right, if we really simplify this, this is really kind of banking, what Ferry calls the banking. It's like me depositing money in a bank. It's like you depositing knowledge in a student's head. Okay, so I love theories that actually say, you know what? It's never the case that students are a blank slate. It's never the case that there's nothing going on in their heads. Students have, young people, old people, it doesn't matter who we're talking about. We've all developed what scholars would call a sense about the world. It's not always a good sense. It's not always correct. But we've all learned to make sense of the world around us. If you look at the horizon, your sense-making of the horizon is that the planet is flat and it just stretches out, right? That is my sense of the world. So what is education? It's actually it needs to involve getting me to unlearn that in order to learn something else, right? Learning, in other words, always involves some unlearning, right? It's not the case that I know nothing about addition. When I'm really small, I might think that addition is this. If everyone's looking at me, addition is this. So if you say, what is 2 plus 2? I might think, oh, that's 22, right? That's my sense of adding. What I have to do is unlearn that idea to learn that 2 plus 2 is actually 4. This is happening all the time in education, right? Students have already made sense of the world around us. A lot of it is not right. But the point is, there's never nothing going on in their heads. So learning needs to grapple with the reality that something often needs to be unlearned, okay? So here's the challenge. What does it feel like to unlearn something? Okay. I love picking up a book and saying, oh, I always thought that was right, and look, Tina and Julie say I'm right. What I don't like doing is picking up a book and saying, wow, this is showing me not only that I'm wrong, but maybe I'm contributing to the problem, right? I don't like that kind of learning. This reminds me of The Matrix. Keanu Reeves, do we all remember The Matrix? All right, so The Matrix, set in the future, machines have taken over the world, right? And humans are in hiding. They're basically batteries, right? So what the computers have gotten consciousness. They've come alive. And how do computers need batteries? They need power. And so what's the source of batteries? It's actually human bodies, right? So no one would willingly say, yes, hook up, wires to my head and treat me as a battery. So the way we have to do that is we have to put them in a coma, right? And we have to connect their brains to a computer program that makes them think they're living 30 years earlier in this world, when really the reality is they're in a coma. They're batteries to machines. That was my half-a-minute summary of Thank you. So the beginning of the movie, Keanu Reeves' character, Neo, is like, something's going on. Something's not right with the world, right? And so he's given the blue pill, red pill option. Do we all remember the blue pill, red pill option? So I don't remember the colors, so I'll make it up. So if you take the blue pill, you will go back to sleep, and you will continue to think that this is the real world. Okay. You take the other red pill, you will wake up, and you will see what the world is really like. So there are like two sequels. So obviously he picked the pill that would wake him up, right? And he would join the battle. And there's this one scene early on after he's woken up where he's learning everything that I just said, that the world is really decades in the future from what he thought, and that it's a very oppressive world. The humans are in hiding. They're constantly fighting the machines. They're eating like slop, and it's just very dangerous and scary and oppressive. And it's literally dark, right? Because they're living underground. Okay, so there's a scene where he's so upset by this realization that he stumbles backwards and he falls to the ground and he vomits. What I like about that scene is it reminds me that unlearning is a very uncomfortable process, right? We don't want to get students that uncomfortable, but the reality is that is happening all the time. Now, in education, again, what does the gut often tell us? Let's avoid discomfort, right? In education, we often don't want to enter into those really uncomfortable places. But what's the problem? The problem is if we don't address discomfort, then what happens to that student? When I'm uncomfortable, if you're telling me something and you're making me uncomfortable, my gut reaction isn't to say, wow, that's making me uncomfortable. Tell me more to make me more uncomfortable. Like, that's not usually how I respond. If you're saying something that makes me uncomfortable, my reaction is often, I need to not hear you. My reaction, in other words, is to resist. So learning involves unlearning. But unlearning can make us uncomfortable. And when we're uncomfortable, we often resist. So if you're not addressing the reality that learning involves unlearning, you might be constantly leading students into uncomfortable, resistant places that are getting in the way of exactly what you're trying to do. And the more invested they are in that knowledge, the more resistant we can imagine them being to learning, right? I'm not that invested in the idea that 2 + 2 is 22. So if I have to unlearn that, my level of discomfort might be this. I might not really be all that uncomfortable. But I might be really invested in the idea that I am not a racist person. And so if you're trying to teach me, no, actually, we grew up in this incredibly racist society where everyone is mired in racist ideology. In other words, everyone is slightly racist, right? Everyone has a hard time thinking outside of racial ideology, let's put it that way. That's a hard unlearning to grapple with. That, I can imagine, I'm going to be really resistant to. All right, so what does it then mean to teach and learn in ways that help students to productively work through these states of crisis? This is a theory that I call learning through crisis. Powerful learning always involves discomfort, a state of crisis. The problem is we don't often address it, so all we're doing is getting students to be more resistant, right? So what does it mean to grapple with that? In these three lenses, what I've tried to do is basically tell a commonsensical story about teaching and then say, let's complicate that story, right? There's the formal curriculum and the hidden curriculum. What does common sense tell us? Get rid of the hidden curriculum. And I'm trying to say, no, let's complicate that story. Because the hidden curriculum, arguably, can be the most powerful aspect of my teaching, right? What does common sense tell us? There's cultural diversity. So I need to tailor my teaching to that diversity. Or how do we complicate that story? That tailoring not only can be hugely stereotyping, but it actually may not address the power imbalances that will continue in that student's education, right? By the way, Delpit's theory is a very controversial one. So I encourage you to grapple with that complexity, right? Because what's one of the biggest controversies of her theory is that she's not addressing the system. Of course, I think I would argue She's not trying to. What she's trying to do is say, tomorrow, I cannot change the system, but I can help that student in my classroom. So not a perfect theory, it's a partial theory as well. It's very controversial. So let's grapple with that, right? And then this final theory, learning. Learning isn't about filling a gap. Ignorance isn't about a lack of knowledge. There are theorists who argue that ignorance is actually a resistance to knowledge. So how do we grapple with that in teaching and learning? Yeah, let's take about 10 minutes to talk about handouts 2A and 2B.
Yeah.
Seems like a great group. I appreciate that these are really beginnings of conversations, and so I hope that you all will be able to find the space and the time to continue even after today. Let's talk though about the third theme, which is how do we act, particularly how do we act collectively to address systemic changes. And the theme I wanted to, which I mentioned earlier, which I really want to focus on, is the theme around diving into contradictions, which I steal that title, by the way, from a new book that just came out called Diving into Contradiction, I think. Which, I mean, the topic is not necessarily relevant, but it's a great theme and a great book, so I encourage you all to check it out. But what I'm really, what I find really compelling is not when someone says, here's the best way to teach, or here's the best policy, but rather when someone really takes seriously the notion that every way of teaching has its strengths and weaknesses, and there's something to benefit from the gaps. Or every policy has its strengths and weaknesses, but there's something to benefit from its implementation in this context. In other words, seeing strategies as partial, as situated, is what I find really compelling. So what I thought I'd do is throw out a few ways that I have appreciated thinking about complexity and contradiction to see if it can spark some conversations about how you all might approach this work. So the first way I want to think about contradiction is really around activism or social change in the abstract. Because I like to remind people, or I like to remind myself, that activism is a necessarily contradictory move, right? Especially identity-based activism is about saying who we are and what we're fighting for. And you cannot do that without at the same time saying who we're not and what we're not fighting for. Which means that any activist movement is going to be creating margins within the very communities that I'm advocating for. And so what's a great example? Safe spaces, right? For all kinds of groups, we're talking about creating safe spaces. Well, because every group is going to be diverse within itself, we can imagine that safe spaces are safe for some people in that group, but not necessarily for others. I think about gay-straight alliances, right? Lots of research shows that in different schools, it's safe for a subset of the LGBTQ student population, right? Some of the earlier work, for example, by Lance McCready shows that in the school that he was studying, the gay-straight alliance was much safer for the white students, particularly the white female straight ally students, right? We can say the same thing about cultural clubs. Like in that school, it was also the African dance club. That was very popular with the African American students. But not so if you were gender nonconforming or lesbian, gay, or bisexual. So safe spaces, I would argue that what his research shows is that those spaces were not failures, but rather those spaces were examples of what always happens in safe spaces. Right? Safe spaces will always be safe for only some and in only some ways. So the challenge isn't to come up with the safe space. The challenge is actually to implement a strategy and to remake it as you go along. Safe spaces need to always be remade, right? Just like curriculum needs to always be rethought. So how do we engage in this kind of paradoxical move? Launching an activist strategy or a social change strategy while acknowledging that because it's always going to be partial or complicated, that it needs to be constantly remade. This gets at the second thing that I want to talk about, which is teaching. And I'm going to build on what I was talking about in the second section of this session, which is that teaching is also always going to be partial. And sometimes, not sometimes, but really I would say our challenge is not to find that best textbook or that best curriculum or that best lesson plan, but rather to acknowledge that it's the gaps in the textbook or the gaps in the curriculum or the gaps in the lesson plan that actually can provide some of the most significant fruit from which we build on. That was a really bad mixed metaphor, but the foundation to build on, right? I think about the seminar that I ran for student teachers a few years ago where I had a teacher in a mixed level or a non-track 9th grade English class. And she so struggled with classroom management. And so one day she said to me, well, I can't wait till I'm tenured because then I'm going to request the honors and the AP classes so that I can really teach English. And so at the next seminar, I was like, let's deconstruct that. So I said, what does it mean in all of your opinion to teach? Is it what happens when everyone's behaving? Or is it that management and instruction are actually inseparable, that they're the same thing, that they're interconnected in very complicated ways, and that what you're considering to be teaching is perhaps a very constrained and problematic way to think about what it means to teach, right? So contradiction, complexity, I think it permeates so much of what we do. My third example about contradiction is really about the macro, because there's so much language. Let me return to conversations around the achievement gap. There's so much framing that happens around the achievement gap that says that the achievement gap is a sign that schools are failing. Well, in many ways, it is. Obviously, schools are struggling to address inequities. We talked about that all morning. But I am really compelled by those who like to say, actually, maybe the achievement gap is a sign that schools are succeeding. Because public schools in this country were never created to level the playing field. We created schools for the elite, and as we were forced to integrate more and more, we found more and more ways to sort them, right? Whether it's through segregated schooling, or just, first of all, not even allowing students into schools, but then we segregated. And then once we ended segregation, we really jumped into tracking students, right? And you could argue that schools have always played primarily a sorting function in our nation, right? So the purpose of education, we would say, is equal educational opportunity, or preparing everyone to succeed, or leveling the playing field. But the function has often been the exact opposite. It's often been to sort and to maintain social inequity, right? And if we look, the whole field of comparative education, those of you who study comparative education, is exactly this topic, is how across the world have different societies created school systems that actually function to maintain inequities and hierarchies rather than to take them apart. Well, so going back to my achievement gap story, so therefore some people argue that the achievement gap is a sign that schools are succeeding. They're accomplishing exactly what they were set up to accomplish, which is to maintain and sort. So sometimes when we have this conversation, though, people respond, well, then if schools were set up in this very problematic way, if schools have always functioned, which they have in this very problematic sorting way, then maybe we should get rid of public education, right? And there are many who also argue that. There are many who, just a few decades ago, right, one of the major elements of the Republican Party platform was to get rid of the U.S. Department of Education. Think about the business sector that's saying public schools have failed, so let's privatize, right? That's actually going to foster competition. It's going to drive improvement through this kind of marketizing of public education. So there are many people who would say that maybe we should give up on this idea that public education can actually serve these more justice-oriented goals. What I like to argue, however, is that public education may be the case, it is a case,
then it has always served this sorting function. But at the same time, public education has also always been a site of struggle. It's where we as a society struggle over defining who we are and what we want to become as a nation. In other words, it is precisely where we need to invest more, not give up, right? And again, it goes back to just like all of my other examples. It is only in working through these contradictory elements that we are going to advance justice. Let me give one final story. I was once sitting in a panel where there were several lesbian and gay out teachers or administrators. And this was a panel for student teachers. And I was in the audience and I was watching the panel. And some of the, not some, all of them were saying, I chose the school I'm at because I can be myself. I can be very out. I'm very comfortable doing my activism, right? And what I was concerned about was the idea that all the student teachers in the room who may be identified as LGBT might think, oh, okay, my job is to find a place where I can be fully out. And so I raised my hand and I said, I want to tell a slightly different story because I taught in a very conservative Catholic school as one of my first places where there's no way any of us were going to come out. But that doesn't mean that you can't do some very powerful activism even in that context. In fact, I would argue that in different contexts, activism looks differently. And we need to engage in different kinds of activism depending on the context that you're in. So it's not the case, in other words, that social justice teaching happens only when the context is non-oppressive. Because the reality is that every context is going to be oppressive. So social justice education, anti-oppressive education, equity-oriented, democratic, whatever language we want to use, happens only when we grapple with the complexities of our context. It happens only when we're working through oppression. In fact, that's sort of one of the phrases I like to use is that anti-oppressive education happens only when we're working through oppression, not when we're in a context where we want to pretend that there is none, right? So that to me is the heart of contradiction, of working through contradiction. That to me is the heart of what we need to be naming, right? We need to be naming the ways that diving into contradiction opens up spaces for different kinds of social change or educational change or activism, right? And that then leads to handout number 3, which is really about trying to name some of these contradictions and think about how we move forward strategically in that kind of a space. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to take about 15 minutes, and then we'll have some time at the end after that for a few groups to share some of what you've come up with. And I think as has already been explained, our facilitators are actually going to pull together all of your comments. So you'll get a chance to see what everyone's talking about, but we will have time at the end for just a few groups to share. So let's talk about handout 3.
How can we imagine that we have critical
Yeah, that would be great.
All right, thank you. So I think we'll just take a few minutes to see if any groups want to share one or two things that came up in your conversation, either throughout the morning or specifically on this topic of how we might act. Does anyone want to share one or two things that came up from your group? Yes. Oh, are you raising your hand? Oh, no, okay. No pressure. I know we're compiling all of this, but we thought we'd see if there's anyone who wanted to share. Yeah, Jerry.
So at the University of Oregon Ed Studies program, they've just gotten an IRB approved. That's an international internal research board that has approved us to do conduct research on the effects of EdTech on our program as we're implementing it. Right, so we'll have doc students and faculty involved. And it's going to be opportunistic. It's sort of a catch-all research approval, so people can come in and take whatever angle they want on this. But it's to make sure that as we're doing it, we're documenting the effects and the ways in which we're working to make sure that TPA doesn't narrow our curriculum in ways that we find to the problem.
That would be such an important study. Yeah, glad to hear. Thanks. I do think that's a really great strategy, partnering with others to do research on impact, because I think we don't have enough of that kind of research, right? There's lots of people saying, here's what we think these policies are going to do, but what's the actual evidence that they will accomplish what we think? And anecdotally, we know that a lot of these strategies or reforms have the exact opposite kind of impact. So let's study that. Yeah, great. What else? What else are you all doing? Yeah.
Well, we're in the process of a point of entry of building a new middle school in Springfield, and so we talked about that as a point of entry for having conversations around, equity, around curriculum, around how we're teaching, how we're developing. So
That's great. Yeah, let's look at that.
Some leverage to make some changes.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love taking any kind of opportunity as a reason to kind of push the conversation and to push the broader conversation. I was at an event yesterday where someone was talking about, now we're seeing more and more schools where the very young students are being asked, what's the goal of education? Oh, it's to get a good job. It's the very narrow way that we're thinking about education that even filters down into how students think this, why they think they're here. And I think that every opportunity we can to reframe that conversation, we should take advantage of. Yeah. It kind of makes me think of, public education isn't just about education in public schools. Public education is about education of the public sector. And we need to see our role as really educating the public and pushing that conversation, right? Maybe a couple more thoughts? What else? Yeah.
We talked about complexity. You read us off on a complexity. That when a teacher is emphasizing anti-oppressive situations in the classroom, that there may be fear on the part of the teacher that parents, administrators, school board are going to complain, and how that fits into the picture, and how, how that fits into the picture.
Yeah, I think this is why seeing our work as part of collectives is so important. Whether that's a critical mass in the school or being part of a larger virtual community, but I think finding the support from others is important, but also situating our work in something bigger is really important. Yeah. Great question. How about one more thought that came up? Anyone?
So one thing I've been grappling with as an administrator is how do you write with a teacher an anti-oppressive SMART goal?
Yes. Good question.
Great start, Joel.
That goes back to some of the earlier things about how we do things in contradictory ways, right? We address standards even as we critique them. We prepare people for high-stakes testing even as we critique them. And same with designing lessons within a framework, even as we're trying to expand or trouble that very framework. I find that to be, both what makes teaching and learning scary, as well as what makes it incredibly exciting and open-ended, right? Is that the work is never done. And I hope that we find many more spaces and opportunities to support one another in doing exactly that kind of work. So it's been such a pleasure and a treat to be able to join all of you this morning. I so look forward to hopefully not another 5 years before I'm back in Eugene, but I also just look forward to hearing about all the incredible changes that you make possible as you continue the incredibly important work that you're doing. So thanks so much, everyone, for your time.
We have about 2 more things to share with you, and then there are lunches that are arriving that are being set on a table outside, and lunch bags, so that you, I know, all have many things to do. Some of you might want to stay and continue to talk downstairs in the lobby by the fireplace. Others of you will grab a lunch and go. So there's a variety of lunches coming. So we started this day talking about hope and then hearing the voice of a teacher. And I'm going to share just briefly about a teacher. All of these wooden figurines are teachers either here within the Department of Ed Studies or they're future teachers who are in a class that just this last several weeks has done all of the LGBT outreach work and training. This is Ishelle. Ishelle is in the class, and I'm sharing her story with her permission. She's in a class called Education as Homophobia right now. And in that class, we've done a series of projects. It's a senior culminating class. And these future teachers are learning how to bring these ideas into the classroom. They all came into the class for different reasons. And one of the things we discussed and what you'll see in the poster outside with these wooden figures is that students need to see someone who looks like them. They need to be brought into a space where they know that it's for them as well. And Tina and I co-teach this class, and so Ishelle was able to see pieces of her identity standing in front of the classroom. Ishelle also brought into the classroom her younger sister, who's a senior in high school within this community, who identifies as a lesbian. Ishelle also brought her Black bilingual identity into the classroom, and her mother has been at all of the events with her and her sister that we have held. And many of those pieces of that identity are wrapped up on this piece that she's created, and this series of pieces that sits in the downtown library right now for the rest of the community to see. Yesterday, Ishelle, her little sister, her mother, Carmen Urbina, who is a 4J District Community and Family Coordinator, Tina, myself, 40 teachers, future teachers from here, and 40 current teachers in the classrooms. We're working really hard on a curriculum that exists outside of classrooms. And so part of what I would want everyone to think about for these teachers and for the children and for the future of our schools is how do we bring these bodies whole and intact into our classrooms so that they can come into our colleges, so that they can become the teachers of tomorrow.
Business pieces so we don't forget and have Dr. Rosiek share or close out our event. Please do leave the work that you created on your tables. Part of the work that we need to do next is to take that information and figure out what we need to do with it, to do some work, to then hand it back out to you so that we can keep the conversation going. So leave those here. If it's compelling to you and you have a need where you may want to take those conversations back, we have extra up here if you want to take them with you, if you find them helpful. You also will find Dr. Kumashiro's book on your table. Those are gifts for you to take and share, to read and take with you. Okay.
My last job is to introduce Dr. Rosiek. The front table has myself, Tina Gutierez-Schmich, Courtney Rath, and Lillian. Is Lillian still here? And Jerry on that table. Jerry is the pink figurine on the table. Those are the 5 people who pieced together what you're seeing today. We didn't send Kevin a wooden figure. And so Dr. Rosiek will close out this thinking.
Thanks. So I won't take too long, but I want to give some thanks first. Thanks to our speakers and thanks to you and the work that you're doing. First, Kevin Kumashiro. What a remarkable person in presentation, and so I also want to highlight that Kevin is recently been made a dean of the College of Education, but at the same time he has been enormously active in lobbying both at state and at the national level on a lot of the issues we just talked about. I got an email from him a few months back, and he asked me to be the Oregon representative to talk to our senators about the ESA legislation, and he organized that nationally and organized a petition nationally to have an influence in this kind of conversation on that national database. So I would like us all to thank Kevin both for that larger work and for being here today. And then, especially for those of you who are in the community, you know how important these things are to both Julie and Tina for organizing today's events, for organizing the entire UOTeachOUT events, and just sustained engagement and providing of opportunities for us to have these conversations, because we don't get to have these conversations very often. I mean, I work in a teacher education program whose identity is built around issues of social justice and built around the ideas of transforming education in a way that makes it inclusive and elevates public conversation. And my faculty meetings are about compliance with the NTPA. It's about how we can revise our handbook to make sure it's clear for our doc students. It's about all those things that we often do, and we just don't have enough structural opportunity to do this. So I would like us to thank both Tina and Julie for that. And so now, I guess about us a little bit. When we talk about education, whatever level of education we're at, very often we have conversations about what we call in the business pedagogy, or teaching techniques. And we want to talk about how best to deliver the curriculum to students, to develop subject matter, to deliver subject matter knowledge to students. And that conversation is about something we call, at least in academic circles, pedagogy. It's the conversation about how to teach. It presumes we know what is worth teaching. We take that as a given, and then we have the conversation about how, the mechanisms, the techniques. It's a very important conversation. There are better ways to teach, and there are worse ways to teach. There are important ways to assess whether we're actually doing the things we think we're doing. All that's really important. There's no part of this conversation that is fundamentally anti-assessment, that's fundamentally anti-feedback loops, it's fundamentally about anti-information. The concern is that when that's the only conversation we're having, we presume too much. We presume that we all agree on what's worth teaching. We presume that we have the wisdom to identify what's worth teaching. We presume that the state-level conversations that are happening in political circles are actually capable of having the wisdom to identify what's worth teaching. But it turns out there's a long, sustained, 100-year, 1,000-year conversation about what is worth teaching. And it is almost never resolved. And that conversation is important to keep present for us all the time. In the field of education and scholarship, that's the conversation about curriculum. So you have pedagogy, how you teach. Curriculum conversations, which is what is worth teaching. And that field is remarkably diverse. In that conversation, I'm just going to give you a few of the terms that are used in the literature. We sometimes talk about the mandated curriculum, which is the curriculum that the state specifies in some content standards. And, but we can also talk about the published curriculum, which is what the publishers produce that is supposed to track the mandated curriculum, but often for anybody who reads the published materials, doesn't necessarily satisfy all the mandated curriculum. Then there's the planned curriculum. So if you're a teacher in the classroom, you sit down and you plan a lesson, drawing on the published materials, maybe trying to keep an alignment with the content standards that you're given from the state, but you plan something specific, which doesn't necessarily always match or is limited to the content standards, and sometimes tracks the books really closely that are published, but sometimes doesn't. So that's your planned curriculum. How many people here are actually practicing teachers at some point or another in your lives? Right. So things don't always go as planned. So then there is the enacted curriculum. So here's what I plan to do in the classroom, but here's actually what happened in the classroom. Okay? So now we have mandated, published, planned, enacted. Okay? Then we have the learned curriculum. So I may have enacted this curriculum. Did the students learn everything that I think that I taught? No, they don't learn everything. So then there's the learned curriculum. So because there's a difference between the enacted curriculum and the planned, the published, etc., and the learned curriculum, we need to assess what was actually learned to see what the difference is. So then we have the assessed curriculum. But the problem is, the assessed curriculum is not the same as the learned curriculum. Because we don't have the means to assess all the things that are learned, nor all the things that are enacted, nor all the things that we would like to aspire to teach. That's not because assessment is imperfectly implemented. Sometimes that's it. Sometimes we have really good assessments, and they're imperfectly implemented, and we need more fidelity to treatment, as some phrase some people use. But there's also types of learning that we don't have the means to assess. Now, I don't just mean that in like one hand, here's the stuff we can measure, and over here is this mystical quality of teaching that nobody... No, there's some middle ground here. There are forms of learning that we could assess. I have a great colleague here, Gina Biancarosa, who wants to look at literacy comprehension. And when she does research on literary comprehension, it's easy, not easy. We have some really well-developed means of assessing literacy within a certain range of what counts as literacy. For example, phonemic decoding, some of the basics. We have some pretty consistent measures of that. It's important to track that information and actually understand what we're doing. But comprehension is harder to measure. Like whether students are actually understanding the things that they're actually decoding in the text. Well, it turns out there are really good measures of this. One way that you can measure this is to create a text that has flaws in the narrative line, right? So that you talk about something and all of a sudden a character in the story does something that's clearly not in keeping, or use the wrong pronoun with the to refer to this, et cetera, et cetera. And if a student reads this, and then when they hit that snag in the text that you deliberately put in it, and they slow down because it doesn't make sense to them, you know they're comprehending it. We can measure comprehension by creating these narrative texts, putting flaws in them, having the students read them out loud, and then measure when they delay. That's an expensive form of assessment. We can't do that for every student in the classroom. So we have an assessment that might work for comprehension, but it's not scalable. So we have the assessed curriculum, right? And our assessments can't actually track all the things that we need to teach, that we want to teach, or that are being learned in the classroom. So there's that. And then there are parts of the curriculum that probably aren't measurable. Like, are we teaching our kids to be caring people in our society? Are we helping them to understand what it is to be a citizen in a democratic community, where they have to make decisions about values, not decisions about facts, but decisions about values that will condition how they all interact together, and then that will affect their lives in the classroom, and maybe the school as a whole. That's a very important thing for our children to learn. We're probably not able to measure that because we're going to figure out maybe 2 generations down the line whether our civic government's working very well. I think maybe we need to go back and look at what was happening 30 years ago to kind of ask what's happened to our current political situation now that's so polarized and not terribly functional, at least at the national level. So there are types of learning that we probably won't be able to assess in any sort of these ways, types that are sort of not scalable. Then there are things that, of course, that Kevin was talking about, hidden curriculum. Things that are not explicitly parts of the curriculum, but they nonetheless teach things to our students. I mean, I had a great kindergarten teacher for my daughter, walked into the class one time, and she had the students come up to the board. She had the board and had the boys put their name. This is actually, it was new. Boys on one side, girls on another. And I walk in and I'm like, it's like hitting a wall, right? Because I spend my time talking about queer education issues, and I realize, look, the binary boy versus girl doesn't work for everybody, right? But here was somebody who was fairly politicized and progressive, and she had created an organizational scheme for students and helping them learn their names, and she was also teaching something else that she wasn't aware that she was teaching. She had a narrow conception of gender identity. And so there's hidden curriculum moving through our schools all the time. That's not on the SBAC, right? That's not on the Smarter Balanced Assessments, but it is an absolutely important part of what we're doing in schools. And so then all of that, you might consider a part of what we call the experienced or the lived curriculum. I have an 8-year-old in elementary school, and my 8-year-old goes out in the playground, and when she gets into my truck at the end of the day and I pick her up, I ask her what went on in school today. I give her kind of carte blanche, let's talk about it. And about 60% of the time, what I get reported to on is what happened on the playground. The playground is where stuff is happening. There are moral lessons happening on the playground. I'm debriefing with her at the playground. I'm trying to help her be a better person in life, be able to cope with really complex situations by talking about the playground. So that's a part of the experienced curriculum. Her experience of school is there, as well as like, how did math quiz go today and all that kind of stuff. So the lived curriculum. So we have all these different types of curriculum. But what we have now in the current educational system is a fairly obsessive focus on the assessed curriculum. We've gotten ourselves into a conversation about one part of our curriculum, not about all these other parts of the curriculum. And I think, I'm not in everybody's head, I'm not in everybody's heart, and I'm not a mind reader, so I don't know why people do these things. But it's really clear to me looking at schools that a whole lot more is going on than shows up on the test. Almost everybody I talk to says this is the case. I meet very few people who are actually working with children on a regular basis who don't know that's the case. It doesn't mean we don't feel it's important to assess and know whether they're learning to read, but more is going on. And I think part of what's happened is in an effort to be hard-nosed and realistic, like I don't want to go into a school and have a teacher tell me that, I'm teaching this great whole language curriculum because I really love these stories, and then students end up illiterate at the end of the couple of years of teaching. Now, I'm not on one side or the other. Literacy is not my area, so I'm not on the big wars between whole language and direct instruction. I'm not taking a side now. What I'm saying is, it's a worthwhile conversation to have about whether you're actually having the effect that you want to have. But I think in the effort to be hard-nosed and realistic, like tell me whether we're actually having the outcomes we want, we're seeking to measure reality in increasingly precise ways. And as we become more focused on the process of measurement, we begin to mistake reality for what is being measured. We begin to ignore all the very real aspects of the educational processes that we cannot currently measure and may not be measurable in a scalable fashion, and that may not in principle be measurable. Many things I'm assuming that you talked about some at your tables during the course of the conversation. There's lots of things going on that are not measurable. And in our efforts to be realistic about it, be hard-nosed and hold ourselves to account, right, we ignore all those things. So ironically, in our effort to be hard-nosed and realistic, we're ignoring large swaths of the reality of education. In our efforts to be realistic, we're actually being unrealistic. We're not paying attention to the reality of teaching. And something like that's been going on for a while. And we can have conversations about why it's the case. Something has been lurking in the conversation about education and probably public policy in general that has to do with distrust. That we don't trust one another to have these conversations. And so we try to, instead of trusting one another, we try to trust the object of the test to make sure that you, Joel, are doing your job, because I don't want to talk to you about what's going on in schools. I want to talk to your teachers. I want you show me on the test, because I trust the test value, but the tests aren't trustworthy. They don't capture everything that's happening. And no matter how much we don't want to be vulnerable to one another and dependent on one another's judgment, we are as a community. We rely on one another. And I really, when I walk in and talk to educators in my daughter's school, if they hand me a test and go, here's what's happening, Jerry, well, okay, I got that. Tell me what my daughter's like in your class. I need to have a conversation with you. I want to hear that. Right? I want that to be the primary relationship. Because in the end, I don't think all these other parts of the reality of teaching we have any access to unless we have that relationship. And that's being consistently pushed out in our policy conversation. It doesn't have to be that way. Now, we know that there's a large conversation around No Child Left Behind and ESA and the Smarter Balance test, and that's the context in which we're working. But I think there's also a parallel conversation that's going on. The fact that you're here, the fact that other things are happening, conversations are happening at the national level, the petition that Kevin has helped take forward to the federal level, that overall there's some awareness that it's not working. It's the focus on assessment and higher stakes mandatory standardized testing has not produced the promised closure of the achievement gap that it was basically invented for us. I don't actually agree with Kevin. I don't think that's what it was invented for. But that's how it's sold to us. It's become more of a political beach ball, and it's made reasonable conversations about teaching between teachers, parents, scholars more difficult to have. This should not be the exception. The conversation we were able to have today should not be the exception. Right? These should be more the rule. I think there's some good news, at least on the Oregon front. Right? There is, it appears we're kind of at an inflection point politically. If you've been following the local legislative movements, House Bill 2680 that relates to statewide summative assessments has passed both the Senate and the House by overwhelming majorities. And House Bill 2680 prohibits the use of the results of statewide summative assessments developed by the SBAC consortium to use as summative ratings of schools and of teachers. So the whole purpose of the SBAC is to produce a means of evaluating rating teachers and rating schools, and now Oregon has passed through both houses legislation that prohibits that test being used in that way. They also passed House Bill 2655, which passed the House so far overwhelmingly, and will move to the Senate very soon where it's anticipated to pass. And that provides parents with an unrestricted right to opt their children out of statewide tests. And it requires all districts to inform all parents of their right to unrestricted right to opt out of tests. So what you start seeing happen is the parents are getting involved in this conversation along with teachers. Teachers are constrained. Teachers in 4J have been pressured not to speak to parents about opt-out rights. The principals are even more vulnerable. They're not protected by a union. Right? And so there are strong expectations. I've heard principals being told that their job is to assess. Right? Their job is to implement the tests. Right? That's not the principal's job, in my opinion. It's certainly not the only job. It's not their primary job. I like the tests to be implemented. But principals are not in a position to push back against that the way in which parents are, and parents are pushing back against it. And so now we start to see this broad-based coalition. And why would a coalition of teachers, parents, and others be pushing back against this? Because they're closest to the experience of children. paying attention to the real experiences of children. The realistic complexity of the experience of children is going to happen because the people who are closest to children are going to speak back against it. Now, I think in that context, that's why these conversations are important. That's why your work is absolutely important. I'm really glad you've been here, and I commend you to go forward. Pay attention to your best wisdom and your best insight into what's happening to children, and find your way into that collective activity that I just described. That parents, teachers, principals, educators of conscience at every level, teacher educators, getting together and speaking back against this. Not against one another, but against a system of thinking that is constraining our ability to talk about the realities of teaching. Thanks so much for coming, and speak.